What's up, everybody? My name is Alan Kett. Welcome to the Museum of Graffiti's Oral History Podcast. This is the very first one. We're really excited about this because it's been a dream of ours to launch a podcast, and our friends at Modelo helped make this happen. We wanted to do this to celebrate oral histories and to celebrate people that are mark makers and important members of our culture. You know, I think it was great that this lined up with Modelo's work currently in celebrating people that have a fighting spirit and that have this attitude of perseverance, much like our first guest today, Mr. Cey Adams. What up, Cey?
What's happening? Thank you for having me on the show. And if I heard you correctly, this is the inaugural first episode. So this is a great way to kick off the season.
Word up. Here we are. First show.
Yes.
Distinguished guest, Cey Adams. So a little bit about Cey. For those of you that don't know, Cey Adams first started out as a writer, graffiti writer that is, in Queens, New York City, back in the 70s, and ended up transitioning into the studio world, making paintings for galleries around the world, and discovered his passion in design, went on to found or co-found the Drawing Board, which created incredible, iconic, and award-winning works of art for the likes of artists like Biggie Smalls, and I would say Craig Mack, and Run DMC, Beastie Boys, so many, that's a whole nother conversation. He's had a very illustrious career, and so it's an honor to have you, Cey, on here with us for our inaugural podcast and in general, period.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I hope you've done your homework because I'm ready to dig deep in these hip-hop crates and really get it on and talk about the history of the culture. So let's go.
Let's go. So Cey, first question, we want to go back in time. You know, you go back and to a time of the early years of the graffiti movement. It's 1970s, New York City. How did you discover just the writings on the wall, graffiti? When did you first come across it?
Well, I probably was in junior high school, so I was a preteen, and I've been an artist my whole life. Let me start by saying that, so I set the stage. I've been an artist my whole life, so I noticed graffiti way before I was actually participating. I've always been a fan of tagging and throw-ups and bubble letters and all the rest of it, but I really came in contact with it seeing when I was walking back and forth to school in the early to mid 70s.
And so what attracted? Is it because you liked art, that you saw it as art, or what was it that initially pulled you in?
I just have to say hand styles. I just loved calligraphy, and I think back in the 70s people had really creative ways to tag their name, and it was legible to some degree compared to the way things are now. It wasn't so much that people were trying to disguise what they were doing, but they took specific pride in the way that they wrote their names. And I'm not saying that people do not today. I'm just saying that to me as a teenage kid, it seemed like, beautiful calligraphy, really great hand skills, and people just really went out of their way to make it look special.
What were some of those words or names, if you could remember?
Well, certainly, it's really interesting, because I come from Queens, New York. There were a lot of writers that I did not know were from Queens that tagged and wrote their names. So, like, for example, Quick was a Queens writer who had a couple of different styles, and he was one of my favorites back then. Certainly, Jester was another one, and back then people had usually two ways they would write their name. They had the more basic way that they did all the time, and then they had the more elaborate way with, the quotes and the stars, and, sometimes they would put a cloud around their name, a la my buddy Eric Hayes. And oftentimes when I would see these things, this was a whole sort of, masterpiece unto itself, because that was what people did in the early days. Another writer was Earl Poet that I remember. And then obviously, to me, one of the greatest of all time, Stay High 149. Stay High just had this beautiful way of writing his name. And if I'm not mistaken, was Stay High Voice of the Ghetto also?
He was.
Okay, good, because I don't want to get in any trouble. I know you're graffiti enthusiasts and historians will jump all over that one. But there were so many people that wrote their names in that way. And as a kid, I just gravitated towards it. I just loved, the style of it all.
Do you remember the first time you wrote your name?
I do. Funny enough, the first name that I came up with was Fire, F-I-R-E. And it was, taken from the Ohio Players song, Fire. And I don't know, this is like whenever that song came out, maybe 1974. But I never wrote it anywhere outside of my bedroom. But that was a little name that I had. And what I discovered was all of those things I just mentioned took a really long time. And so I decided I needed a name that was even shorter. And it's funny that my name is only 3 letters, but having a name with 4 letters seemed like too much. And I also think when the song got really popular, it just sounded kind of corny. And I thought, nah, this is not going to fly. And so I shortened it to a 3-letter name. And I settled on Cey because there was a baseball player named Ron Cey. And I'd never seen that, wording before, C-E-Y. And everybody else had, a 3-letter name, and I thought this was a good 3-letter name because I just never saw anything like that. And I thought I could do something with that and make it my own.
So when did you go from having figured out the name to then venturing outside of the room, writing your name on the street? Like, when did you cross over and get the nerve to do that?
It's about 1975, I would say. And even then, I had practiced for quite a bit. And really, I should sort of preface it by saying I took little tags in the street because there were so many places where you could tag where there was no way you were ever going to get caught, because where I was in Jamaica, Queens was off, anybody's real radar. And certainly back at that time, law enforcement, they weren't really looking for graffiti writers in that way. But what ended up happening was I quickly realized that tagging in the street was one thing, which we all now know as getting up, but tagging on trains was when you were officially committed. And that was sort of when I realized that no matter how much I tagged in my neighborhood, it wasn't going to resonate with what was going on trains.
So, but how did you figure that out? What was it that gave you those cues?
Well, I'm a New Yorker. I traveled everywhere by train. And if I went with my parents, the minute I got on the subways, you couldn't deny that graffiti was everywhere. And this is back, like I said, in the 70s, where the insides were bombed. And you couldn't even sit down without, ink on the back of, where your head would rest, or in some cases even, the back of your, jacket, because people just tagged on everything. It was literally the wild, wild west back then.
Seeing this, deciding to make that leap into doing it, did you ever consider the illegality of it?
Not really, because that was sort of built into it. You sort of learn that. I started writing, when I had a friend in junior high school, and his name was Q2, Cuetwo. Sometimes he did TOO. And he was friends with all these older writers. And people like Jester, and I don't want to name check a whole bunch of people that stopped writing even in the 70s, because it might not resonate with your audience depending on how young they are. But he was the one that introduced me to graffiti full on, and it was magic markers, it was paint, it was ink, it was all the tools of the trade that people now consider legendary must-have items, everything from, pilots to flow pens, like all of it. And when I think about people that wrote in 70, 71, 72, I was aware of it, but it took a long time to learn the language. And it also took a while to figure out how to get the materials, because I did not have any money. And that was a whole nother process, just how people acquired, markers and ink and all of it. This was way before people were creating their own markers and their own, homemade inks and all of it. It was all a much simpler time back then.
How difficult was it to acquire the materials?
Very, because to be able to go into a store and to rack spray paint is one thing, and just to clarify, racking is when you would go in and you would just steal or lift spray paint without getting caught. But markers behind the counter, Flowmaster ink behind the counter. You had to get very, very creative. And, my friends and I that I came up with back then, they had a system for everything.
So all right, so you want Flowmaster, and it's an ink and markers. What was the system?
The system was to get the person from behind the counter to go to another part of the store to get something, and then somebody would dip behind the counter and grab a couple of, cans or markers, then come back and, buy something that, cost a fraction of that. And then, somebody else would come in and ask for something else behind the counter. It was like a weird shell game.
Sure. So you get the materials, Q2 puts you on to the game.
Just for the record, does his name even resonate with you?
For me, I remember Q2 only because I lived in Jamaica, Queens for a little while.
Oh, okay.
And there were still remnants of tags from the 70s around, and he was one of them.
Yeah.
There were, FE.
Yeah.
Was another name that was around.
Yeah.
And you could tell it was old by the styles.
Yeah.
Who else was it? So 5.
Yeah, yes. There you
right?
go.
Was a name. I met him many, many years later.
Yeah.
But there were also the names.
Like Force 5 was another
5.
guy
Remember
that
name
bombed
too.
a lot. And like I said, 001. And even to this day, I didn't know, like now Jester is a buddy of mine, and he is my number one graffiti hero, and he knows this. And I'm sure he probably can't wrap his mind around why I love him and his work so much. But he was always my favorite because he did everything. I loved his hand styles. I loved the way he tagged. I loved, how his throw-ups looked. He just did everything. And so I've been fortunate enough to be friends with him in recent years, but I never knew how many aliases he had.
DY 167.
Yeah, certainly, the great DY 167, but then he told me he did Tint 2.
Tint 2.
And I guess 001 was his partner. And I don't remember. See, and this is where without a cheat sheet, I'm going to get myself in trouble because I haven't thought about this stuff since I was that age. That's how long ago I never thought about these memories. Like I think about him, but even when I've done interviews in the past, I've never gone down memory lane to the point where I'm dipping into the 70s. That requires a lot of brain power. I just turned 63 last week, so it's a lot of history. This is well beyond, this is over 50 years of like talking about this work.
Right, and you've been so removed from it
yeah.
for so long, and
Yeah.
so I appreciate you going back with us and trying to jog these memories. And for us as a Museum of Graffiti, it's important because we like to find out straight from the source these histories, right? Your history, and then the intersection with all these other people. You mentioned Force 5, you mentioned Jester. One day we hope to have Jester on here speaking about it. And this sort of tapestry of stories helps us paint a picture of an era that's gone.
Yeah.
And really an era of pioneering.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned people like Quick.
Yeah.
These are pioneers. These are
Yeah.
people that sort of laid the foundation for us even to be here talking about this movement. And so, you speak of Jester with such high regard, for style. How did you discover your style or develop your style?
Well, certainly the one thing that you learned back then, and I'm not saying that I learned this by somebody sitting next to me, putting their arm around my shoulder and giving me guidance. You learn the hard way that you had to have your own name. It couldn't be similar to somebody else's name. You had to have your own look. You had to have your own letter, and if your name began with C, you had to figure out a clever and or creative way to do something with the letter C. And it was challenging back then because you didn't have a lot of people to look at to get inspiration, because that is like the number one graffiti no-no. You don't copy anybody. You can't even say you're inspired by anybody. Graffiti artists are so hard to, there is no inspiration. You just have to be motivated based on somebody else's work ethic. And so I will say that. I was motivated. And the thing I had to my advantage was that I was an artist. So I knew back then I loved clean lines and bold shapes, and there was always a crispness to my work, which is something that I still carry on to this very day. And that was always my calling card. I just loved clean, bold graphics.
I mean, it's right there in the wall style piece.
Yeah.
It's a thick line around your piece.
Yeah.
And it is reminiscent of what you were doing back then.
Yeah. And that was really the thing that I figured out very early on. And graffiti writers, if you were a part of a crew, you had the, love and support of, your fellow brothers and sisters to sort of help your style develop. But if you were somebody like me that was sort of somewhat a loner, I had my own little crew called City Crew, and it stood for Children Invading the Yards, as in train yards. And City was also sort of a play on all city, or aspiring to be all city. I'll just say that. But I thought it was really cool to have a word like city, and then you figured out what the acronym was going to be. So it worked backwards. It wasn't like, because the idea of children is kind of like somewhat, adolescent and soft, but nobody ever gave me a hard time about it. And once I think we started to establish ourselves around this city, it was one of those things where it really just took off, and all of a sudden people wanted to be in my crew. And one of the first people I met was a writer named Vade that lived in Hollis, Queens. Really was like, Forest Hills, sort of where Tribe Called Quest is from. And he had a brother named Wise3, and another friend of ours, Demo. And at the time, Vade and Demo, they would all sort of congregate at my house because I lived sort of downtown-ish. And Hollis was, basically deep in the suburbs where I was. They didn't even have a train station where Vade and Demo lived, but there was a train station not that far from where I lived at 169th Street. So my house became the headquarters. And at that time, this is like around, I don't know, and this is where my math gets a little funky, like 1975, depending on who you talk to, we started TPA, the Public Animals. And I have two brothers, and they dabbled in writing graffiti. It's not even worth saying their names because, they quit still in the 70s. So it's not like anybody would remember their names unless they were a part of our little clique. But for all intents and purposes, we had about 6 people. And it was, Vade and his brother Wise, his name is Reggie, and Vade's name is Rodney. And then Demo's name is James. And then, my 3 brothers. So what is that, 7? Yeah, so there was like 7 of us, and that was the TPA City crew. And from there, when we started to move around the city, we started to meet people, and we started putting other people on. And that was really how not only City was born, but TPA as well.
Well, and those crews became known, as you mentioned, as you're traveling through the city, they got well known, and it made its way into books.
Yeah.
We heard about it much later, and it grew. And so I know from seeing the work back then, there were many other members that joined CAP, as an example, KAP, or SCOP. Lady Pink.
Yeah.
So
Lady
many
Heart.
right?
Yeah. And again, I have to sort of preface it by saying the original members, because now so many people lay claim to saying that they were there in the very beginning, but they weren't.
Rewriting history.
Yeah, and it's okay, I'm not running for office, and neither are they, but it's one of those things that now is sort of kind of interesting, that when people are talking about their oral history, it just goes in whatever direction serves their narrative. And, again, this is kid stuff. I don't care. What am I going to do? I'm going to get mad at somebody because they said the wrong date or because they claim they did this or that. Like, I don't care. Okay, great. They did it all,
So, let's go back to, these friendships that you developed, this crew that you formed. You guys actually started painting trains. Not an easy task, maybe much easier back then, but you got good at it, and you did it a bunch. In your show, there's some great photography by Martha Cooper that shows some of those silver pieces back then. How did it feel to paint the trains and see your name go around the city, and were you recognized by your peers back then?
Well, the first thing I will say is the show that he's referencing is called Cey Adams' Departure, 40 Years of Art and Design. And it just closed at the Art of Hip Hop Museum here in Miami, adjacent to the Museum of Graffiti. And one of the things that was really great about the show is that it chronicled my 40 years as an art maker, but it starts out early in my career when I was painting subway trains, and to see some of those photographs really is emotional because without people like, not people like, without Martha Cooper, I wouldn't have had a historical record of any of that early work. I mean, granted, we took our own photographs, but we were not professional photographers, and the formatting sometimes was off, the lighting is off, the angle is off, and they certainly weren't professional. And as time went on, we realized people like Martha Cooper and Henry Chalfant and a few others were really, they were just, to say that they're pioneers is not enough. They really were the people that documented the culture for everybody that came after. And they were, the ones that taught us how to archive all of this material.
I think what's so special about them, even from back then, is that they understood the importance of the work so much that they would dedicate their lives to it.
Yeah.
Hours every day or every week, running around the city at their own expense,
Yeah.
developing film, all the things that they were doing. And without them, you're right, there wouldn't be the documentation that we have today. And the photos that were exhibited in your show, taken by Martha, were beautiful photos,
Yeah.
wide angle shots. You could see the city,
Yeah.
right? Really, really beautiful. Not like, I think, the photos that we were taking as kids where we were right up on the train,
Yeah.
on the platform. She had a different vision of it. And thankfully,
Yeah.
she was there. But they were the only ones.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is a perfect opportunity to thank Martha, because when she was documenting, she would always make sure to give me a Polaroid, just so I had a record of it. She never asked me for a nickel. And even many, many, many years later, 40 years later, I decide I'm doing books, and I'm putting this exhibition together, starting as early as 2019, and I approached her about getting negatives of some of those trains, and she went into her archives and she says, boom, here, take whatever you need. And she didn't ask me for anything. And I thought that was really generous of her. And that's not the time that we live in anymore. Everybody knows the value of this work. And it speaks volumes to the kind of people that cared about this before everyone else cared about it.
Since the beginning.
Yeah.
Since the beginning. And so many people have them to thank for
Yeah.
launching their careers, organizing events, shows, all kinds of things. So thank you, Martha, and thank you, Henry,
Yeah.
for all the things that you did for all of us when we were just kids.
Yeah.
And didn't really know, but they knew.
Yeah.
It was the few good adults that were around. Did you have challenges back then with other adults in your life, family, that didn't understand what you were doing?
Yes, but I have to say I come from a big family, and so my mother and father did not understand what my brothers and I were doing when we would leave the house. Our room smelled like ink and markers and spray paint and just dirt. And the real thing was, don't get arrested and don't have anybody calling this house. Those were the two things that my parents said over and over again. And so you sort of knew when you walked out the door, if something went bad, you had to figure it out on your own. And so ultimately, whatever obstacles I ran into at that time, I dealt with them as best I could. But I'm thankful to say I never got arrested, and I'm thankful to say that I never had any altercations with any other writers or graffiti crews or anything like that. And that's a big deal, because some people have these rich stories about how the interaction with all of these folks was front and center. In some cases, that took precedent over whatever work you were trying to create.
Did you, in that era, create work that you look back on and you're like, all right, that was a masterpiece? Or do you remember feeling that way, a sense of accomplishment beyond just the trains? Was there something that stood out back then in those early days that you're like, all right, this is a feather in my cap?
Not really. The only thing I remember is maybe 2 times when I went out bombing by myself. And this, again, is so great that Martha has a reference where I did a whole car, Say One City, in silver and black, and I was by myself, and I wrote it at the end of the train. Otherwise, I wouldn't even remember. But I know for some writers, they only worked by themselves, so that wasn't that big of a deal. But back then, I don't know, maybe, I wasn't probably much smaller than I am now. My frame size hasn't changed a lot over the last 40 years. But, to go to a train yard by yourself is almost certainly asking for something bad to happen. But I did it a couple of times. And so if there was ever a moment of celebration or accomplishment, I think it was when I did those sort of things. But ultimately, I did not come home each night with a sense of gratitude. It was more like I got it done, and I was happy if my parents didn't know I was out, because my brothers covered for me and I could get to school without any problem. And it was really more like that. And so in a lot of ways, it was like the way some writers have referenced being a secret agent or a superhero with this secret identity. The goal was to get in there, do the work, and get out and have nobody notice until, the train is rolling out, for rush hour in the morning.
Were you one of those people that were chasing the trains the next day to take pictures, looking for your work?
Oh, yeah. You definitely had to. And you had to always call up Martha and Henry and let them know what you did, what side it was running on, what line. And for the most part, we concentrated on the 2s and 5s in the Bronx, because those were the real fame lines. Those were where your Blade and Comets were, and Scheme, and you could probably name a bunch of folks, Crash and Part, and certainly Lee, Kell and Mayor and all the rest of them, and just that was the line that you wanted to be on, those, because like I said, that's what I remember being the lines where you could get respect.
When you sort of ran your course with writing, what made you shift from wanting to paint trains, run amongst your peers in the train yards, to then participate in the emergence of graffiti on canvas?
Well, my son Eric was born in 1984, and so my whole graffiti career is not more than 5 or 6 years. So even if you say, I'm really starting to venture out in 1975, 1976. By 1984, I'm ready to hang it up completely. That's not that long. And I just felt like there was no upside to it. I never wanted to accomplish being on every line. I never wanted to, I just wasn't in it for that. I loved the rush of doing it, but there were so many obstacles that would prevent you from doing, the great work of somebody like Dondi or Lee. I mean, these guys were just unhuman. The stuff that they could do under the conditions that, we had to deal with when it came to doing this work. And, it's hard to believe that they were young when they were doing that. Their sense of balance and form and light. Oh my goodness! It really is unbelievable when you step back and you think about it. Scene 2, he's another one. When I look at these photographs now, I marvel at how they could orchestrate something so beautifully when I knew what they had to do in order to create those things.
Yeah, the effort's incredible, and the outcome for them, it's incredible. But you're not chopped liver.
Well, thank you.
Your trains are great as well, and I think you talk about them sort of persevering through these obstacles and these conditions, danger, the illegality of it, getting the materials, figuring out how to do it. You figured out these things, and then you mentioned, you have a son, Eric, and so you shift.
Yeah.
You decide to go into a totally different direction. You make a mark on the trains and participate in this movement that's dangerous and exciting, but you decide to shift gears into something that was also very new, even more new.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is the thing. At the time when Eric is born in 1984, I already felt like everything that I had done prior was kid stuff compared to literally having a kid and having to provide for this little young person, even though at the time I'm already 20 years old. And so 20 seemed like it was old to be doing that. Prior to that, I was a teenager. And this is also at the time when a lot of my peers are making the transition to working on canvas. But that also meant finding some form of gallery representation because we didn't have relationships with collectors. People talk about that today, but in the 80s, that was a very rare thing. Keith Haring, is curating some, small exhibitions. By the time they have New York New Wave, which was a gigantic collective of, East Village artists and graffiti artists turned, professional painters. That was a big deal. And it was a small group of people that cracked the code. And we had 51X Gallery by Richie Colicchio. We had the Fun Gallery with Patty Astor. We had, GPI Graffiti Productions with Joyce Tobin and Mel Newlander. And I was lucky enough to be one of the people that got picked up by them because they saw something in my work that was sellable. They saw that I could communicate on canvas and it still had the essence of the work that I was doing on subway trains. And also, not that it's a small thing, I was somebody that was good around adults. I didn't have this threatening approach. I was camera ready. I was, open to media training and all of this stuff. When you think about that time, graffiti was the Wild West. To professional career people, we were, vandals. We were dangerous. We were scary. And I was just never that kind of person. And so I think that everything that I just mentioned made me more palatable and made them willing to take a chance on representing me and selling my professional fine art work.
Did you receive resistance from friends, from crew members, from people that you were painting illegally with? Did they understand the shift?
I think that this is when a lot of our friends, you were either, only a small group of people got picked up for representation. I know like Sidney Janis picked up Crash, and I almost hesitate to even name people because I don't want to get the facts wrong. But let's just say
Knock 167, maybe a couple of people.
a lot of people got picked up, but it was the elites. It was, the Crashes and Dazes. Futura had a run with Tony Shafrazi, who, was representing Keith Haring at the time. I think Ramel Z had a couple of relationships, and then, A1 and Toxic and Core and the rest of, those guys, they went to Europe. A lot of people went to Europe, and some people went to Asia. And I just knew that I wasn't going to leave the country. So immediately I thought it's time to transition out of this. And when I met the folks at GPI, I just said, this is going to be what I'm going to put my focus into.
So you do it. When did you go and how did it work for you to be doing the studio work and then eventually shift to design? Because it's
not the same thing,
it's a very different thing.
It wasn't exactly at the same time. But, when I'm doing that, it's 1980, 81, 82, 83. So I think even by the time 1984 rolls around, I'm already sort of done with the fine art world. I sold a bunch of paintings, but these were also 90% of the time they were all group shows, and so you make 5 to 10 paintings and they sell them, at whatever speed they sold them at. But it wasn't like you were doing a one-person show. And whenever I did do a one-person show, it was a gallery that wasn't as established, and it wasn't like the show sold out instantly. It was really sort of piecemeal. And so, like a lot of people, I got disillusioned with the idea of quote-unquote gallery representation. And it just so happened at that same time, I met Run DMC and the Beastie Boys when Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons were forming Def Jam Recordings. And it just gave me another vehicle. And hats off to my buddy Eric Hayes, because he was the person that really helped me refine my graphic design skills. Eric was on it early, and he showed me a lot of things that I did not know how to do. And it made me realize that graphic design was a technical skill. You couldn't bullshit your way through it the way a lot of people can today. You had to really know how to do cut and paste, and you had to know the difference between safety, trim, and bleed, because you were working with printers. And if you designed something and your markings were off, everything in your design would be printed wrong, and they would print it wrong and then charge you to fix it. And so once I learned how to do that, I started to do, more logos and design related things for the bands that were represented by Rush Artist Management, which was, Russell Simmons had a management company that managed Run DMC and the Beastie Boys and Public Enemy and LL Cool J and EPMD and Slick Rick and De La Soul and Stetson Sonic, and oh my goodness, I could go on and on and on. And so I had plenty of design work working with all of those people. And so I was doing posters, flyers, bumper stickers, tour backdrops, and anything that had artwork on it, I was designing. And it was a lane that I had all to myself. I did so many t-shirt designs for everybody that they managed, whether it was Curtis Blow or Slick Rick. And it felt like a much bigger lane than when I was competing in the world of graffiti and fine art, because, to some degree, it felt like we were just crabs in a barrel. We were young and we were professional, but people still found ways to take advantage of us. When I was doing this, it was like I was on a desert island and nobody knew where I was or what I was doing. And a lot of people couldn't crack the design code because there was specific language that you had to know. And like I said, all of those things about being able to talk to people was a big deal. And not to, put you on blast, but you remember what it was like with the way we came up. A lot of people took pride in being rough around the edges, and they liked intimidating suits and ties. I wasn't one of those people.
You sound like you were able to navigate these multiple worlds in a very good way, whether you were writing and you said you had no altercations, no beef, no problems with crews, entering into the gallery world, being able to get representation, and then, stepping into the design world and getting work, which was the toughest part of it all. It's one thing to be a designer and learn the craft and the trade. It's another thing to get the work. Do you remember, in those days, rejection, and how, and if so, how did you come back from that?
I do. Oh my goodness, like, you don't have any tissue on the table right now. That was a cue for all of you to laugh it up, but clearly our
studio audience.
Studio audience is catching Z's over there while I'm pouring my heart out over here. But rejection, it was a big part of it. But the other thing is, this really, again, this was like a secret society. When I started talking about graphic design, nobody knew what that was. And these are the early days. And so whenever I ran into resistance, it was when I was going to a corporate meeting and I have my portfolio, but I can't get past the security guard at the big advertising agency because I'm a young person of color, and they think that I'm a messenger dropping off a portfolio. Even if I said I'm going to see ex-creative director on the 20 whatever floor. They're like, yeah, the mailroom is in the basement. And I says, no, you don't understand. I'm going to a meeting with so-and-so. And he says, yeah, I heard you. The mailroom is in the basement. And I remembered thinking, oh, you forgot to say boy, you know? And that's what it felt like. You know, I just told you I'm going to a meeting. Why can't you call up to the 26th floor, announce me by name? And it was just sad that that was your obstacle. It wasn't even your talent. It was just somebody's going to make an executive decision that you don't belong there because you don't look like the kind of person that would be having a meeting with a senior advertising executive, so they're going to send you to the mailroom. And it was a horrible feeling. And the only thing that not really even saved me, but the only thing that helped me was that I knew I had nothing to go back to, so I wasn't going to let that person that's in a security position stop me from getting in that elevator and going up to that meeting. And I really had to deal with that more times than I even care to remember. And I told this story once about that experience. And once I got past that obstacle and I got upstairs, the other thing that was happening was the music was making a shift. And the popular music of the day that was created by 40 and 50-year-olds was being replaced by this new music that was created by teenagers and 20-somethings, and that was the birth of hip-hop. And when that transition happened and a record company like Def Jam all of a sudden now was in charge of creating a huge body of music for all of the big companies like Columbia, RCA, Sony Music, and all of that. I went from this small graphic designer to being able to run my own graphic design firm with my partner Steve Carr. And we created our own design firm called Drawing Board Graphic Design, and we got a budget to build our own design studio and to hire our own team. And before long, the very same people that were running those art departments that had the double-breasted plaid jacket with the patches on the sleeves and the tight suits and all the rest of it, those people got replaced and they all got fired, and myself and Steve were running that department, and we got to bring in a lot of young fresh talent and give them opportunities without making them feel like they had to go through those obstacles and jump those hurdles that I had to jump just a few short years prior. And it was a great feeling to be, no older than the people that you're hiring, but you already have that little bit of experience, and all they have is mock-ups, and you've sort of laid the groundwork and the foundation to be able to, put people on, as we like to say in the culture, and give them opportunities. And I remember thinking the other people that I wanted to help were my fellow graffiti artists, because if I could do this work, they could do this work. They certainly have the skill. What they did not have was the opportunity. And sometimes they didn't necessarily speak the same language in the office, but I knew that I could handle that part of it. And very often times I would have people like Phase 2 come in, And I would sit him down and I would say, hey, I want to commission you to do a piece of art. All you got to do is the stuff that you do. And, you know, for your listeners that don't know, Phase 2 is one of the pioneers of what we now call hip hop, you know, graphic design. He designed the earliest club flyers along with Buddy Esquire and you know, a couple of other folks. And he's certainly one of my heroes, even though I did not know it in the 70s. But I later found out when I published my first book, and I went back and did research and learned about, you know, the life of Phase 2. I just knew him as a writer. I didn't know he was this graphic, technical wizard.
It's amazing to hear you speak about that and talk about bringing him up there. And I know that you gave the opportunity to a lot of people, you know, and I remember those days, the Def Jam days. And yeah, and shout out to Phase 2, rest in peace, Phase 2, incredibly influential in design, but also in graffiti, in DJing, and all of it. He was, if there was, I think, a Renaissance man that embodied hip hop, it was Phase. He wrote lyrics, he rhymed, he DJ'd, he knew how to dress, he was a mentor, he was a publisher, and a very special human being. But you know, you reached back out to put him on, but so many other people. I know that in the drawing board's work and the work that you touched over all those years, there's moments when you could see that must have been a graffiti writer. I don't know who did it, but it must have been. You know, and I remember when you gave Todd James a shot.
Yeah.
You know, because Todd was my boy, or is my boy, and, you know, we would hang out a lot back then. And when he decided to become a designer and an illustrator, we knew that it was the right call for him because he was naturally gifted, but he didn't know how to do it, like how to get put on. And I remember when he got put on and got the Redman gig, how happy we were that someone gave him work.
And you know, just to clarify, I meet Todd James from my buddy Dave Skilkin, who was a part of the Beastie Boys crew, and he wrote Shoddy. And so I meet, you know, Todd, who was writing Reese at the time, and, you know, a couple of other folks as well. But, you know, an amazing talent. And Todd has always been easy to be around. And you know, it was easy. It wasn't a complicated thing. And I love seeing how his career has just blossomed and taken off. And I just saw him recently, a couple of months ago. Same guy. Todd has never switched it up. He's just doing his thing, full speed ahead. And that's the thing that really makes me happy when, you know, and I'm not saying I gave him his start. I'm just saying, you know, I threw a little piece of work his way. And he's just one of those guys that would have figured it out one way or another. But, you know, that's what you're supposed to do. It's just, you know, if you have a little bit of knowledge about how to do this, it's like we can't be crabs in a barrel. Like, there's enough to go around. There always was and there always will be. And I sort of never felt threatened by my friends and my peers. I just always wanted to create opportunities for people. And I still do that to this very day without, you know, any sort of interest in recognition. It's just, if somebody's talented, give them a shot.
Put them on. Well, Cey, you and I can talk here forever, but I think, you know, I think what you're sharing is an important part of your story, and I think it speaks to your character, and that speaks to your ability to contribute so much just because you were open. You're a connector. You're sort of a conduit to great design, to great projects, to greatness, period. And so we were very blessed to have you participate and come down here in Miami and spend time with us, present your 40 years of art and design departure exhibition, which we really loved, and which, you know, the visitors that came down here, all the audience that we greeted every day, were better informed about, you know, someone like you. And I think a lot of times when we talk about hip hop culture or when we talk about graffiti culture, we're talking about people that nobody knows.
Yeah, yeah.
We just see names, we see words on the wall as we drive by or move by on the train. No one knows. These are sort of anonymous members of our society. And so the point of this particular podcast and the work that we're doing, you know, thanks to our partners, Modelo, is really to kind of pull back the veil and get these stories out there so that our collective history is known, so that people can say, you know what, I learned about Cey. I didn't make it to his exhibition, but I'm learning a little bit about him through this podcast series. And it's important for us to document these moments. You know, I wish some of our friends and our peers that, you know, gave so much to this culture, contributed to our own personal development, like a Phase 2, were still around, and Buddy Esquire that you mentioned earlier, to be able to hear their stories, you know. And so the reason why we're doing that is to document these important oral histories from our community that have contributed to this culture that we are building. So thank you very much for doing this.
You know, real quick, Ket called me, I want to say in 2019, to design a logo for his new museum called the Museum of Graffiti. And you know, I don't even know if you had Allison was your partner at the time when you decided to do this, but you reached out to me, and I thought that was really classy because you wanted the roots of graffiti to be embedded in the work, you know, by nature. And so, you know, I felt like you could have gotten so many people to do that, and it would have still been a spot on job and opportunity. And I was really honored that you asked me to do that because it felt like a full circle moment for me. And, you know, the other thing I wanted to say was having this exhibition up was something that meant so much to me because, like always in our culture, we have to create the things that we want to see, and we can't wait for them out there to do it for us. We're old enough now where we are telling our own story in our own words, with our own, you know, images. And we know the history. And now we're at a point where we're telling that history the way we want to tell it. And Lee Quiones came to the exhibition, and every time I've had a one-person show where I think I've cracked the code for me in terms of creating something that I'm really proud of, Lee came to that show and he looked at my work and he said, wow, you're doing something that's unique and different, and it's really special. And Lee is, you know, like, forget Mount Rushmore, numero uno. It's a little Spanish that I do know. Lee's my favorite. And I know that I'm not alone in saying that. He's a lot of people's favorite, you know, along with people like, you know, Dondi and you know, a handful of other folks. He's the greatest. And
living legend.
For him to come to this show and to look at the work and really want me to give him a tour and to look at every single thing, and he wants to pick it apart and dissect it and talk about it. And, I got an opportunity. I've known him for 50 years, and I've never gotten an opportunity to chop it up with him in that way and to reference his work as well, and to say to him, you are one of my idols. I remember being a kid in my bedroom, and I'm looking at these photographs that we used to share, and this is how, words spread about work that was being done, amongst us. And going down to, the Lower East Side to see that handball court that he painted the very first time with the lion. And I'm thinking, wow, this guy did this on a ladder? Like, look at the balance, look at the form, the color. Like, where did he get those colors from? And to think that he was the same age as me. And I'm thinking, if I'm a teenager, he's a teenager doing this? And to be able to just chop it up with him in real time meant so much to me. And Eric Hayes and I talked about this. When Roger created, Beyond the Streets, and it was an amazing survey of the work that we all did. And to have a place for us to congregate and to not only share our stories, but to showcase our work, and for it to have a retail component, because people have families, they have bills to pay. It was a great thing. And, it's not a small thing that, you all take on this responsibility to give us a home and to deal with all the stuff that comes from dealing with family, because that's really what we are. We're family. It's just, a big deal. And I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And it is a big deal. But I do think that as we've matured, and grown up in this movement, some of us, many of us, want to give back and participate in meaningful ways. And I think for me, it goes back to meeting people like Phase 2 and even Henry and Dave Schmidlap, and others. And in particular, those men saying, you need to do this. You need to step up. Don't let someone else write your story, your history, or our history. Make sure you're there to set it straight. So I took that to heart and do this work. One last question that I want to ask you before we wrap. Because this painting is here, this painting on my left says Wild Style. And I would like you to share with our audience a little bit about what Wild Style is and what it means to you, related to this painting and to the word and the meaning.
Well, in a lot of ways, like the word hip hop, the way I came up, Wild Style was a way of creating letters and letter forms that were, a couple of steps sort of beyond standard. And most of the time it was synonymous with being unrecognizable to people that were not familiar with the work that we did as graffiti writers. And I was always told that Tracy 168 sort of coined the phrase. I don't know if he was the one who created the first Wild Style piece, but he certainly coined the phrase and sort of verbally, copywrote it, if that's even a thing. But when I was coming up in the 80s, Tracy told me he was the father of, Wild Style. And I never saw anybody challenge that. And also, I think it's one of those things where once it caught on, everybody had their own version of Wild Style. But the way I remember it, when I was coming up at GPI, Graffiti Productions Incorporated, Tracy was Mr. Wild Style. And so when he was ill just a few short years ago, and I was making the work for this exhibition, I wanted to honor him because I spent a lot of years with Tracy, and as many people know, he was a giant, and he was a cartoon character, and he was the king of the tall tale. And, it didn't matter, what part of it was real and what part of it wasn't. That was just Tracy. And whenever I saw him, he always treated me with respect and always humor. And he was literally one of my favorites. And he's in that group, like I said, with Quick and Jester and a bunch of others. And so this was an homage to Tracy. And sadly, I made this before he passed away. And I had the intention of, making sure that he saw it. But I don't think that happened because he passed away during the pandemic. And I'm sure we'll all miss him greatly.
Thank you for the explanation, and thank you, Cey, for your time, for being here with us today, for your generosity, and for your contributions really to this movement and to all that you do. So it's been a pleasure speaking to you and hearing the stories. I hope you come back again and again and again and continue to contribute in the way that you've been doing for so long.
All right, well.
Cool.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, my brother. My name is Alan Kett. This is the Museum of Graffiti's Oral Histories podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Modelo for supporting us. And thank you for Cey for being our very first guest. Peace.